To the Strand bookstore. How are you? I'm one of the events directors here, and I am no relation to the Bass family, though my name is Jessica Strand. It is merely a coincidence. Anyway, tonight I'm thrilled to introduce playwright, screenwriter Tony Kushner and director, dramaturg, and artistic director of the Public Theater, Oskar Eustis, both of whom need little introduction, so I will be terribly brief, since I don't believe in introductions. Tony Kushner's beautiful work ranges from Angels in America to A Bright Room, Cold Day, to a translation of Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage and Her Children, to films such as Munich, and most recently the Oscar-nominated Lincoln. Kushner has won numerous awards, including a Pulitzer Prize and 2 Tonys. Joining him is his close friend and sometimes collaborator, Oskar Eustis. Eustis has directed the New York premieres of Rinne Groff's Compulsion and Larry Wright's The Human Scale, while at the Eureka Theater, he commissioned Kushner's Angels in America and directed its world premiere at the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles. He's also directed at the Trinity Rep, the world premiere of Kushner's Homebody Kabul, both of which he received Elliott Norton Awards for, one for Outstanding Production and the other for Outstanding Director. Please join me in welcoming Tony Kushner and Oskar Eustis. Thank you. Really? You don't need a lumbar support?
Well, it's pretty good.
People have actually slept in that chair.
Exactly.
We'll try not to sleep in the few moments we have. So, Tone, when you started the Lincoln Project, you were not focused on January to April 1865 as you were in the end, in that fine film, in that brilliant screenplay. So can you talk a little bit about the process of what it took to get to that shape of the story and what thought process you went through trying to figure that out? Go.
God, I feel like I've told this 100 million times. To you, in fact.
Pretend you don't know me.
Steven originally bought the rights to Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, which is a 900-page four-way political biography. And I think he actually bought it in 2000 before she had written more than about 4 or 5 chapters, just on the strength of his admiration for her other work and the fact that he'd always wanted to make a movie about Lincoln. I love Team of Rivals. I think it's a really extraordinary accomplishment, but it is a four-way political biography, and it's so, spectacularly detailed. It's like the definition of a book that isn't going to make a feature-length film.
And it's Chase and Bates and Seward and Lincoln.
Well, it's really Lincoln, but she weaves in a substantial amount, and she really also does a good deal of covering Stanton as well, who's of not theoretically a rival. I mean, it's interesting, the political fate of the book, because the title and a kind of misguided fantasy about bipartisanship made, and because we were, the book came out in 2006, I think, when the Bush years, there was a sort of an idea that, his great failing was that he was too partisan. I mean, that was so minor compared to his other great failings. I don't really, I never even considered that as a failing. But that Lincoln, as opposed to W, used people, really let competitors and people from other parties come in and have their opinions. I mean, the truth of the matter is that what you learn from reading Team of Rivals or any really good book about Abraham Lincoln is that he actually listened to very few people. He took very specific kinds of advice when it struck him immediately as being valuable, but almost all the major decisions that he made were his own. And that he actually, he was a great delegator of responsibility because he didn't really have a choice. During the Civil War, he allowed the Secretary of the Treasury a tremendous amount of latitude, and the Secretary of State a tremendous amount of latitude, and he picked really good people. Chase turned out to be kind of brilliant as a Treasury Secretary, and Seward was a brilliant Secretary of State. He allowed them latitude in their own departments, but in terms of major policy decisions, including in their departments, he made his decisions by himself. He was not a great consulter of people. So
Doris's book.
Anyway, so when I finally agreed to do the movie, Steven and I both immediately felt we wouldn't do any battles at all, because it was going to be hard enough to just cover the administration, and that when we had this big conference of Lincoln scholars that I got to ask questions of, one of them was the great James McPherson, who said this thing that made both of us, back away from doing too much about the war. He said the Civil War is a landscape so vast that even a figure the size of Abraham Lincoln can get lost in it, and he would know because Battle Cry of Freedom. I mean, one of the astonishing things about that very astonishing book is that he manages not to do that. It's actually a very good biography of Lincoln and a brilliant account of the administration in the midst of really covering the entire field of the war. But we both decided that there'd be no battles. And then I said to Steven that I would do this only if we didn't have to do the entire 4 years, which I said it's just going to be impossible. You're going to wind up doing the greatest hits. So he agreed to that, and I said, I think I want to start in 1863 in September, when two things happened that I thought were really interesting. One is that the 71 radical men of Missouri, these sort of mostly German immigrants from the 1848 revolution, who were all living in Missouri, came to Washington to complain about Lincoln's lack of radicalism and his, he met with them and had a big confrontation with them, and I thought that was a fun place to start. Also, it's right around that time that Chase begins to come out of the closet as someone who's intending to run for the Republican
Salmon
nomination.
Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury.
You're right. He's in Lincoln's cabinet at that point and indispensable to the war effort, because he's the person who's figuring out how to pay for everything, including huge amounts of deficit spending, which both Chase and Lincoln were absolutely and completely in favor of.
Thank you.
And one of the last things that Lincoln said to his cabinet, Chase had already left, the day that he was killed, is deficit spending is a good thing. You can't really run a country the way that you run a household, Anyway, and then, like so many things that Lincoln and those guys understood, we managed to forget it all and then relearn it and then forget anyway. So I started in 63 of September, right, when Chase starts to make it fairly clear that he's going to try to get the Republican nomination away from Lincoln. Chase was in terms of racial politics, far in advance of Lincoln. He was really a creepy, narcissistic nightmare of a person in many ways, but also a morally great human being. I mean, a really genuinely physically courageous, somebody who put himself repeatedly in harm's way for the sake of not just, emancipation, but actually abolition. I mean, he wasn't an abolitionist, but he was as close as you could be and still be elected senator and governor of Ohio. I mean, he was a serious politician who was also very radical in terms of his racial politics, and also a kind of a nightmare. And he was going to run against Lincoln, and I thought, and Salmon Chase is one of the great characters, and his daughter and the whole story. I won't go into it, but so I started writing and outlining, and I kept coming up with these long outlines, and then I would start writing the script. And twice I wrote about 150 pages, and each time I got up to about, which is the length of a normal screenplay, and each time I did it, I got up to January of 1864. Once I only got to December of 1863, and then once I got all the way into January and felt like I'd gotten somewhere, but it was clearly not going to work. And then the Writers Guild went on strike, so I had to stop writing for 8 months, but I kept reading and I thought about what I was doing. And then at some point it occurred to me, after the strike was over and Steven and I agreed that we would meet and talk about what we were going to do, this was about 3 years into the process, that everything that I had read enough about Lincoln at that point to know that there were certain themes that recurred over and over again, and that they were all present in the last 4 months. So I thought, I'll just do the last 4 months, and that will stand in for the whole. And Steven liked that idea, so I wrote the first draft, which was 500 pages long, and it was divided into 4 acts: January, February, March, and April. And or sort of January, February, the first part of March, which is the second inauguration, which had a lot of Frederick Douglass in it, because that's when Douglass comes back to Washington at Lincoln's invitation. And then mid-March, March 18th to the April 15th, 14th, to the assassination, the period when Lincoln left Washington for the longest time away from Washington during his entire 4 years as president, and at Grant's invitation went down to City Point on the James River, which made it possible for him to be present for the actual end. I mean, it wasn't the exact end, but for the break of the siege of Petersburg and Lee's army to go on the run and Grant's army to start chasing them. And Lincoln was positioned then to make his famous trip up the river to Richmond and to walk through the city of Richmond the day after it fell, which is the most astonishing moment in all of American presidential history, I think. And I thought and so the 500 pages were divided roughly equally in those sections. The longest one was the last one. It was about 200 pages long, and I thought, well, that's the thing. Well, Oscar reads everything that I write before anybody else sees it. And you read the last 200 pages, and you said, okay, well, you read all the other stuff. And then you read that, and you said, this is the movie. And I would have been thinking the same thing, that this is what he's going to want to make. And I think you said at that time, I hope he cherry picks from some of the other stuff because it's good. And I sent the whole 500 pages to Steven, apologizing for the length and saying, I hope you'll, for instance, January is all about this weird fight for the 13th Amendment and the lame duck session of the House. And one of the reasons I like working with Steven so much is that you never know what he's going to do. And he called me after he read the first 150 pages and said, that's the movie, I want to do that. And then he didn't really respond as strongly to the
tragic part.
Well, it was the tragic part, but it's also what he zeroed in on, because, I mean, the thing about him is he has a better understanding of narrative and of what makes a narrative engine run than I think anyone since Charles Dickens. I mean, it's scary how absolutely he understands the structure of story. And I think it's, theater people don't have to deal with narrative as much, film people, and my husband is the first person to point this out to me. Spielberg's narrative is inclusive. No one watching even something like the invasion of Normandy, the storming of the beach at Normandy in Saving Private Ryan. You could stop the movie at any point and turn to the dumbest person in the audience and say, what's going on? And they'd say, well, this group is trying to get here, and they're up here. You can read it completely. And the minute Mark pointed that out to me, I started watching all these other action films where you're just seeing a lot of stuff happen, bombs and car, and you don't know what something bad is happening, and then the dust will settle and they'll tell you who won.
Right.
And when we were shooting the House of Representatives sequence, one moment where when the Democrats make a motion and the conservative Republicans second it to stop the vote till they get assurances from Lincoln that the Confederates, which happened, there's like all these people rushing up and rushing around. And before we filmed it, Steven said, I want you to make it clear to me who's, and I said, well, here are the peace Democrats and the war Democrats and and we talked it through, and I said, but it is chaos. And he said, yeah, but anybody can film chaos. I want to film chaos that people understand while they're watching. And it's not dumbing down. It's what I've come to really understand and love in him is that it's an absolute democratic, small d democratic, and honestly big D democratic faith that if you start from the idea that you're going to include, it doesn't make your work easier or stupider. It makes it harder, but that if you believe that it's possible to tell a complicated story that everybody's following, you'll find that story. And he has a great instinct for it. He knew somehow that we could interest a large group of people in this kind of political procedural, which is what he called it the whole time we were working on it. So,
surprising.
And what he got immediately about the last 200 pages is he said Lincoln isn't active in this enough. What's his, and I worked really hard to try and save some of that to make him, but in a way, he was right. He moved himself out of Washington, out of his arena of comfort and action, and put himself in this position to sort of sit and wait and watch. And his one action, which of course it turns out he took for like 95 different reasons, was to get on that boat and go to Richmond. But otherwise, he had the good sense to let Ulysses S. Grant decide how to do this.
Right.
And it made for a complicated and sort of more passive and contemplative thing.
You know, Lincoln is famously difficult to capture, and I will admit that it's something we've discussed before. He's a hard figure to try and write for because he's a hard figure to try to understand. And can you just talk a little bit about both the difficulty and what you think allowed you to write him?
Yeah, I mean, when I said no for 6 months to doing this, it was because I thought, this, in addition to all the other reasons that you shouldn't do this, like the minute you put on the top hat, and Mark and I started calling him the cat in the hat. You put on the top hat and the beard, and you look like you're selling used cars on President's Day. I mean, it's like everybody's going to laugh. And the whole time I was working on this, I was always seeing TV commercials with some guy pretending to be Lincoln and thinking, oh, God, this is going to be so fucking horrible. And, that was a good reason. But the main thing for me as a writer was I felt, you can't succeed when your character is one of history's great geniuses. You can really only fail. I mean, I'm reading this biography now about Keats and Andrew Motion's biography. And, it's a beautiful biography, and he explains all this stuff, but there's this weird thing, and Keats's life is interesting because it's also heartbreaking, but it's so incredibly short, and he seemed so aware because I think his brother Tom died, and he knew that he was sick, he knows that he's dying, but so he squeezes a lifetime of poetic, sort of the greatest poetic accomplishment really apart from Shakespeare's, I think, into like 3 years. So you see this kind of like accelerated arc. And he's writing, he goes from being a medical student to a medical school dropout to somebody who writes a couple of pretty lovely little poems that would have made him a very minor figure. And then suddenly he writes on looking into Chapman's Homer. And then that kind of goes away for a little bit. It's like those films of kids learning how to talk, that they'll babble, and they start to imitate like what water sounds like, and then they'll say the word water, and then they lose it for a day, and then it comes back and it's really there. And then they start adding adjectives to it. But there's something happens in the brain where it gets it, and then needs to sort of back away for a second and consolidate, or maybe fuse new, whatever, who the hell knows. I don't know what I'm talking about, but but there is this kind of this thing, and then he kind of backs away, and then he starts writing, Endymion and Hyperion, and then he writes in one summer all of those odes in like 3 months. It's just, and you're looking at this and going, okay, this is not. How is this possible? It's just not possible. And
So how do you write a character?
And how do you write a character like that? Because if you've explained to people how they did it, if you've explained how Mozart wrote Don Giovanni, or if you explained how Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, you've failed because you're wrong. You can't. If I knew how to write Hamlet, I would go and write Hamlet. And
Right.
I don't have any idea. I mean, it doesn't seem possible that anybody did that, but they did. And those kind of minds, I think, are just, impossible. And when you read contemporary accounts of encounters with Lincoln, and I think Lincoln is on that level, I really do. I think he's, it's a kind of mind that only occurs once, in several generations, and is capable of a kind of, it's weird because his genius manifests itself in politics, which is a field in which talent matters enormously, but genius, I think, is a rather rare thing. And genius is a rare thing in any field, but in politics maybe even more so. He wasn't a political theorist exactly, although he was in a certain sense. So I thought, this is just, I'm going to fail.
So no, you said no.
So I said no.
And then at a certain point you said yes.
Well, I thought, okay, I'm being offered a chance to write a movie about Abraham Lincoln that Steven Spielberg is going to direct, and really, my father, who grew up in the Deep South adoring Lincoln, and who made sure that when I was growing up in the Deep South, and my brother and sister, that we all understood who Abraham Lincoln was, and who read us the second inaugural and the Gettysburg Address. My father was, as you know, a great reader of poetry and memorizer of poetry, and a great lover of Keats, which is why I think. Anyway, I thought it was too great. It would be cowardly to back away from it. Doris said to me after this meeting with the Lincolnists, and I said, I still don't think I can succeed, Doris. I mean, I've learned a lot about Lincoln now, but I'm going to fail. She said, I know what you feel like. I felt this way when I started my book. I can only promise you one thing, and that is you will never regret, even if you fail, you'll never regret any of the time you spend with Abraham Lincoln. And I thought, okay, well, that's great.
Good.
And she was absolutely right about it. I mean, there were a couple of times when we thought we weren't going to make the movie. When Daniel said no to the script the first time, he'd already said no to another script several years before I got involved. And then he said he liked my script, but he didn't want to play the guy in the hat and the beard. And I think Leonardo DiCaprio is the person who finally said, "Are you crazy? You look in the mirror, and
you Irish
God
twit.
is trying to tell you something." Well, not just an British twit, but not just that. But I mean, Daniel looks like. I mean, this is a weird thing. I mean, he's not only, without any question, one of the greatest actors that ever lived, but he actually looks like. I mean, Stephen took a picture of him in a pub when we were first meeting with him before he said yes, but when he started to say, after he talked to Leonardo DiCaprio, and he started to say yes, maybe, we went over to Ireland to hang out with him and talk to him about the script, and we were in a pub, and he was standing there talking to me, and he's silhouetted against a window, and Stephen took a picture on his iPhone and then emailed it to me, and it looks like a silhouette of the young Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
And that makes a big difference, because the more putty you have to put on an actor's face, even when it's really good and digitally fixed up, that weird sort of galvanic skin, it's like what they say about Duza and Bernhardt, that although somebody just told me that I'm wrong about this and it wasn't Duza, but I think I'm going to say it was Duza.
Go ahead, say it. We want to hear the story.
Well, the difference between the two of them, I think, playing, was it Doll's House or Hedda Gabler? Doll's House. Where does the letter arrive? That's Doll's House.
The letter is Doll's House.
Doll's House. And that they're both playing in London. And my memory is that this was Shaw that said this, but apparently I've gotten this all wrong. But anyway, it's a good story. They're playing, and Bernhardt does this astonishing, sort of opening the letter and reading it, and gestures, and everybody's gasping at her obvious, evident horror. And Duza sweeps the entirety of 19th century acting away because she blushes.
Wow.
And that's the difference. It's that there's something that happens on the surface of the skin with a great actor, and you can't describe what it is. It makes it happen. You have a sympathetic response, and if you put that under rubber, even if the rubber is like really great rubber, you've cut off a huge part. And all he needed was the ears and a little bit of the wart and the neck. I mean, it was a lot less than most people would need. So, what were we talking about?
The question. So you said yes.
So I
understand these reasons for saying yes. So how did you manage to write him?
Well, I also, I thought, okay, so I'm not going to succeed in doing this. Yeah. And really, actually, part of the answer is, you get Daniel Day-Lewis. I mean, because there's a part of the uncapturable, unapprehendable part of Abraham Lincoln can be provided by an actor who brings with him a kind of cosmic. There are a few actors that do that. Vanessa Redgrave, Max von Sydow, Daniel Day-Lewis, Fiona Shaw. I think Fiona. I mean, there's some actors who are just as great as they are, who are much more earthy and solid and clearly of this world. There's something, of the other world that they bring in with them, and you can't make that happen if it's not there. And that really helped. And that's, when you read about people talking about Lincoln who say things like, he was the warmest and the coldest person I ever met. And people loved him and felt welcomed and warm in his presence and felt that he was a great listener, and also found him incredibly aloof at the same time. I mean, something weird going on, that he was a person who was obviously enormously connected to other people, and gave this overwhelming sense, even in his photographs. He managed to communicate this long before there was television to the entire country, that he was a tremendously lonely, isolated figure. And that paradox is something you can't write. But I think that, I had a feeling that there were things about him that I really understood. There was this letter that Seward wrote to his wife about, Seward started, when Lincoln arrived in Washington, Seward's assumption was that he was going to run the country because he was by leagues the most famous person he was Secretary of State, and he should have won the election, and he had worked and done all the right things. He'd done too many of the right things, and he fucked himself out of the chance by being too compromising about slavery.
Right.
But he was certain that with his vast experience, he would be the president, and this bumpkin would make nice speeches and jokes, and then he very, very rapidly, because he was an incredibly smart guy, much smarter than any of the others, he saw who this man was. And it's a wonderful story, their relationship, because he envied Lincoln so keenly and suffered so terribly, and also fell completely head over heels in love with him. His wife said that, you've lost your heart to Mr. Lincoln. But he writes to Frances, who was a very smart woman who was living in upstate New York, in Auburn, New York. He says, our rail splitter grows in stature, is a wonder, and grows in stature every day. And then he said something like his is a wonder. His compassion and his strength grow exponentially, something every day. And it's that combination that you think of always being adversarial to one another, that compassion weakens a person and saps action and strength, and strength is only attained by cauterizing your empathy, and the combination of the two was one of the things that was unnerving, and that gave me a real.
That's beautiful.
That and many other things.
That's beautiful.
And then there were clues to who this guy was, that on a certain cycle, because the one thing I believe about people like this is that there's, so what Virginia Woolf says about Shakespeare, that he was probably an ordinary man to whom genius was sort of grafted like some kind of, forgive me, but like some kind of a hump that she said was sort of like strapped to his back, that he wasn't great in all ways, and she was, I think, referring to his will and how petty and small he sounds, but that there was some, and you read this all the time, so.
Only because we are going to have to stop in a minute, and we're going to take a few minutes for questions. I'm going to interrupt you, which I hate to do. Ask about one specific thing, the Euclid scene. It's one of the most perfect pieces of writing that I've ever encountered, even from you. And you've never told me what made you think. But would you mind setting the scene? I'm sure they've all seen the movie.
It's a scene. I'm glad you like the scene. I liked it too. And it's one of those things, I sent it to Steven, and I thought, he's not going to go for this because as this big turn. It's a turning point in the movie. It's Lincoln is trying to make a decision about whether or not, and this is, I think, really a discovery made in the film. I'm proud of this, that the fight for the amendment was emblematic of a certain conundrum that he faced in much larger ways all during his presidency, which is there were moments that arrived when it's clear that with a certain amount of willingness to surrender principle, he could get the South to give up and come back into the Union, which he said over and over again was his oath registered in heaven, which is in the first inaugural, and I think he took from Merchant of Venice. But Shylock says, I have an oath. I have an oath in heaven.
That's right.
But over and over again, Lincoln had to sort of finesse things so that the North, which was not terribly interested at any point in emancipating 3 million slaves, and that's certainly not why they thought they were fighting the war for the most part, that he had to finesse things so that he could make sure that the end of the war and the return of the South to the Union was synchronous with the end of slavery, partly because he thought slavery was a monstrous evil that had to be extirpated, partly because he believed it was absolutely and completely inimical to the very idea of democracy, and that a house divided against itself and a democracy in which people were owned as property would not survive as a democracy. The idea was too internally dissonant and would fall apart. And he believed that part of our job as Americans was to prove to the rest of the world that this idea of a people's government could work, because in 1865 that was still very much, I mean, it's still a question, but it was, still
Totally
being
a question.
looked at by a number of absolute monarchs with a great deal of sort of like gleeful skepticism, that the Civil War was proof that democracy equaled anarchy. And anyway, Lincoln has to make a decision between pushing forward, getting the 13th Amendment through a lame duck session of Congress, of the House of Representatives, by bribing these representatives, and or bringing to Washington these peace commissioners from the Confederacy, who he's had to sort of invite through the Blairs, a conservative Republican family, in order to keep the conservative Republicans on the side of the amendment.
Right.
It's a concession that he's made, and the presence of these peace commissioners is going to completely screw the process of getting the amendment through. People will not want to do that if it might jeopardize a serious peace proposal. So he's trying to decide which he's going to do, and he's been asked by Ulysses S. Grant to go with making peace, which really rattles him, because unconditional surrender Grant has never, the reason Lincoln valued him is that he wanted to fight until the end and not try and make a false peace. And so he's trying to decide this, and he does various things, and then he goes to the telegraph room to send the answer to Grant. Grant has the commissioners at City Point, and he wants to know if he should send them to Washington on the River Queen on the boat. And Lincoln, I made this up, he has written a telegram saying, bring them in. Right. And then he reads it to his to the operator, and Lincoln loved hanging out in the telegraph room with these young guys and talking to them, and he really loved code. He thought it was hysterically funny. It appealed to his sense of absurdist, because the way code worked was they just kept changing. Green was bonnet, and tree was frog, and so you would read these like insane sort of word salad things, and they could be decoded, and Lincoln liked hearing the word salad as well as trying to remember the decoding. He found all that a lot of fun, and he loved invention, so he loved telegraphy, even though Samuel Morse, who invented the telegraph, was a Democrat who hated Lincoln's guts and told him so the first time he gave Lincoln a demonstration of the telegraph. Sort of broke Lincoln's heart. But anyway, he was a schmuck, the Samuel Morse. So he went with his telegram that he'd written saying, bring him to Washington, as you've requested. And then he says it to the young Homer Bates, who's going to transmit it. And he has to write it down first and then turn it into code, and then they transmit the code. And in between dictating the letter and then waiting for the translation into code, Lincoln is thinking, and then starts to talk about whether or not we choose to be born in the times that we're born in, and then starts to talk about Euclid, and says that one of the first principles of Euclid is in one of the first principles, which is that two things which are equal to the same thing are equal to one another. He says that in the book of Euclid that he's read, and I went and found the translation that he read. It's an 1820s by a Baltimore minister, he says these truths are self-evident. So the minister is using the language of Jefferson, and when Lincoln thought Jefferson was the greatest, he said, as a writer, he said, Jefferson has parsed the moral economy of the universe in the Declaration, and I loved when I read that Lincoln, what he was trying to do was improve his causal thinking. He felt that he needed to, he was sublimely good at it, but he felt he wanted to get better at it. So he decided that he wanted to figure out somebody that he should read that would make him do sequential causal thinking better. And it's so typical of him that on his own, he decided that what he would do is read Euclid. And so he borrowed a copy of Euclid, of the Axioms, and read it and absorbed it very quickly and really understood it and loved it. And it just moved me enormously because, there were lots of rhetorical books of rhetoric back then that would teach, causal thinking and syllogisms and all that stuff. But instead of working on logic, what he went to is geometry, which is not about causality and a straightforward line. It's about volume and space and omnidirectionality. And it seems to me emblematic of Lincoln's thinking, the thing that made him so much greater as a thinker than most everyone else at his time was that ability to see what the French call a coup d'oeil, a blow of the eye. At one moment you can see everything, not just in terms of the entire arena of problem that you're trying to solve at the moment, but also past and future as well. You sort of see consequence and ontology as origin and ultimate destination, and that breathtaking thing. Whenever you read especially the papers that survived about the cabinet's response to the Emancipation Proclamation, it's like an X-ray into how badly things would have gone if any of these other really immensely impressive people, Seward or Chase, had become president instead of Lincoln. Bates, they all give him the wrong advice, and they're all like full of, and it all makes a lot of sense, and it all would have just shot the whole thing to hell. And, he just kind of, it's terrifying. How farsighted and clearly, and so that the
beautiful
Civil War ends with the end of the legal basis for slavery. So that's where it came from, and I was sure that Stephen wouldn't buy it and he, from the first time, every time I send him anything that he really likes, I can tell that he really likes it because he calls me up and he reads it back to me on the phone and says, "Oh, this is great, and then he just starts reciting it, and then I know that it's probably going to make it into the movie. So,
well, listen, we only have a few minutes left, and I'm sure that folks here would like to open up the dialogue. I'm not sure, but I guess.
Sorry?
We can do it without.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, has this been...
No. We don't.
I'm struck by the 500-page initial script and the volume of material and just the enormity of this character. And I'm wondering, could you ever see going back to Lincoln and doing a different art form play? Are there parts of his life that are still haunting you that
I could very happily, I really like the whole 500-page thing, and the February is the coalition that combines of radicals and centrists that get the amendment through in January completely falls apart in February and puts Lincoln in a very dark place, and he closes the White House to the public for a whole week. I think it's one of the only times that he did this. Maybe another time was when Willie died, when his son died. But he closes, I'm not even sure that they closed it then, but he says, "I'm not available to anybody," and he goes into seclusion and starts writing the second inaugural address, which is, in addition to being the greatest political speech, greatest speech maybe ever made by anyone, is one of the darkest. It's like the Gettysburg Address, an absolutely perfect prose poem, but it's one of the most haunting and searching and in a way pain-filled, I mean, the most of any inaugural address. And he closes the door off. At the same time, this thing happens that I think has been really underexplored. He refuses to pardon a Confederate spy, a man named Yates, John Yates Beale was his name. He won't, even though the conservative Republicans are really campaigning to let this guy off. I think he helped sink a Union ship on one of the Great Lakes, and he's begged by friends and by the guy's own sister, which would almost always have worked with Lincoln, to pardon him and not to free him, but just not to have him executed. And he doesn't do it. And that's again a kind of a wonderful thing, that while he's digging, and this is while he's writing the speech, he's digging deep, deeper than I think any president has gone into how do you understand God's purpose when both sides of a war think that God is on their side? Why are we going through this horror? He's also being asked to show mercy, which he was always incredibly eager to show, and he doesn't. He lets the guy die. And there's some kind of, since the second inaugural, this is sort of about karmic. He says at one point in a letter, this is a world of compensations, and I think what he means is he has a sense of a kind of karmic wheel. If you enslave people and derive wealth from enslaving them, you're going to pay by losing all your wealth. If you draw blood with a taskmaster's lash, your blood will be spilled. I mean, there's a very severe sense of justice in the universe that he has. Anyway, it's just full of all sorts of these amazing things. But the problem is, I know one thing for sure. I would not want to work on anything in which Abraham Lincoln was a character now without Stephen and without Daniel. I mean, and I don't understand. I mean, I hate to say this, but, I feel like Daniel kind of, I mean, I don't know. I mean, as Mr. T says, I pity the fool who has to go on and I can't believe I just quoted Mr. T. That's a very... I don't know how anybody else is going to play that part. I mean, I think, it's going to be the best one before Daniel was Henry Fonda, and that was a long time ago. And I just think that there's something that Daniel brought to this that's kind of definitive, and I don't know. There are, Oscar and I have actually talked about one side character things that maybe I would want to go back to. But I don't think, I'd like to publish the whole script, I think. But I have to, because I'm a screenwriter, I don't own it. So, but on the other hand, I have health insurance. So, Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for speaking. It's fascinating. If you were to recommend one book on Lincoln, what would it be?
God. It's one book. What, Fiery Trial? The Fiery Trial by Eric Foner is a great book. I'm very annoyed with Eric Foner right now because of the whole sort of, I think, deeply stupid left criticism of Lincoln that, slavery was already over and everybody had freed themselves and there was no need for an amendment, and it's just absolute horseshit. So I would not recommend that book. I think Team of Rivals is a really great book. I don't think there is one, the reason it's hard to answer that is when people ask me this, I would say that the one book I would recommend, even though it's not actually about Lincoln, but that I think everybody really ought to read about this period, is A Battle Cry of Freedom, the James McPherson. It's part of the Oxford history. And it's kind of when he walked into the room of the other Lincolnists, they're all really nice with each other, which really impressed me because I've been in lots of academic conferences where that has not always been the case. They were very cordial and collegial and willing to say how indebted they were to one another, I think because of the spirit of Lincoln. I imagine if we were making a movie about Adolf Hitler and they'd been Hitler specialists, the atmosphere in the room would have been tougher. But when McPherson spoke, everybody kind of sat back because there is something, I mean, it's an astonishing book. It does not appear, it's one of those weird books that doesn't appear to have an ideological agenda. It's just always right about everything. And it has this kind of God's eye view of the whole war. I mean, you just feel like nothing that's not included. I mean, there's tons that isn't included because it's only, a 700-something page book. But it's a great read. And I'd certainly recommend Team of Rivals. The David Herbert Donald biography is in some ways kind of the best single volume Lincoln, but I really disagree with his interpretation. The thing that's great about it is that there is a different Lincoln for, I mean, there are about 6 or 7 Lincoln biographies that I've read now. The Burlingame is, he's amazing, and everybody owes Michael Burlingame, enormously because he's done such an unbelievable archival work. It's 2 volumes and it leaves out nothing, which is not necessarily, it's fun, but it's a lot. But it also has an interpretation. You have to figure out what Lincoln you want to write about, and one that I think is in a certain amount of disfavor now because it's not as accurate, although in some ways he's shockingly accurate, is really basically the first great one, which is Carl Sandburg's. And, it has its problems, but it's a fantastic book, much better than his poetry. I mean, really, I'm sorry, but it is. It's just, he was, but there's a really fascinating book, which is not in print, but should be back in print. When Sandburg published the last of the 7 volumes of the Lincoln biography, an African-American ophthalmologist in Washington named John, I can't remember his last name, wrote to Sandburg and said, you seem to have interviewed everyone who's still alive, who ever met or saw Lincoln. This is in the early 30s. Did you speak to any black people? Because there's a lot of stories that I've heard, and I live in Washington with a lot of people who actually, old people who knew him or knew people who knew him. And why you don't seem to have spoken to any of them. And Sandburg wrote this angry letter saying, you want to talk to him? Get a tape recorder and talk to him yourself. And the guy did. And went out and got an early tape recorder, and I think the tapes have been lost. I tried to find out if they were in the Smithsonian, but they don't seem to be. But he published an oral history of a lot of people who, and a lot of it is, like in most of the official histories of Lincoln, people said all sorts of things, and you have to really always question who's speaking and what the source is. But and I think the title is "They Knew Lincoln," and it tells these kind of astonishing stories about, some of which are clearly true, some of which are obviously not. But it's an amazing book. There's this new book out by John Burt. It got a rave review in the Times, and it deserved it. It's a kind of an answer. Or a refinement and an answer to Harry Jaffe's very great book on the Lincoln-Douglas debates, A House Divided. And Harry Jaffe is a terrifyingly reactionary homophobe, and even terrifyingly reactionary homophobes. He's really like bad news. I mean, he says gay people are basically like the Boston Strangler. I mean, he's horrible, except when he writes about Lincoln. And he's the only right-wing writer that I've never met him, but House Divided is an incredibly great and incredibly beautiful book. And everything else the guy writes is hideous. But, this new book by Burt is a reconsideration of not just the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but of Jaffe's book. And I've only started it. I'm trying to stop, which is really hard to do because one of the amazing things about the guy is he lived, 56 years. He was in the White House for 4 years. He kept no diary. He refused ever to talk about his childhood. There's a certain amount of reconstruction that was done by Herndon, one of his law associates, right after the assassination, but we don't know a whole lot. And yet it is like Uncle Vanya or Hamlet or one of these weirdly inexhaustible works of art where you can go back to it Middlemarch. Go back to it and read it, for the 900th time. And it's sort of weirder in Uncle Vanya than in Middlemarch, because Middlemarch is, 800 pages, so of course it makes sense that you would have missed things the first time you read it. You see the Chekhov, they're all the same 4 plays. They all have the same characters. It's not much of a plot. And yet, every time you see it, you learn something that wasn't there the last time you saw it. And Hamlet is even worse. I mean, it's just inexhaustible. And Lincoln is like that. It's like, Doris says he's the 3rd most written about person in human history. And yet, very little that I've read is just repeating what's already been said. There's always something new and remarkable. And so...
And Shakespeare being the other 2?
Yes.
One more, if there's one more? Yeah.
As a filmist for film and stage, and you're writing about historical figures and characters and on specific time periods, how do you know when to stop the research and start the writing process?
We just had a conversation with Steven about that today because I owe him a screenplay for our next thing. And it's like, when do you stop reading and start writing? I mean, what I said to him today is there's avoidant time and there's necessary time, and I think there's avoidant research and necessary research, and you just have to have your own barometer. There's no way of knowing. Part of it is subject driven. I mean, I feel like the year and a half of reading that I did before I started writing about Lincoln really stood me in good stead. You never become more than a dilettante. I just got invited to join something called the American Society of Historians, I think, and I feel like I have to write to them and say, I'm not, I play one on TV. I mean, I'm just, you become a dilettante, and then, of course, the minute you turn your attention to another subject, the difference between a scholar and a dilettante is that the dilettante's knowledge will crumble almost immediately, whereas a scholar has a deep familiarity with it that will keep it. It's who they are. It's in their DNA. I think that there are subjects that you simply have to get a kind of very deep grasp of, so that you can begin to feel free to walk around in that world, and you'll have a sense of that. And then there are subjects that are maybe the worlds are more familiar or so impossibly remote that it's going to require kind of more fantasizing than, because there's just not enough information. I mean, if you're going to write, for instance, about the Hittites, I mean, there's a certain amount of it we know about the Hittites. There's a lot we don't know. So and there are some good plays to be written about the Hittites, I think. I think that you have to have a sense in yourself, and usually for me it takes the form of irritation and boredom. There's a point at which it becomes clear that the energy that I'm expending avoiding writing, which is the worst thing in the world, it's the hardest thing, I hate it. It's terrible. Nobody really likes it. I mean, once you get into it and start doing it, but the first 10 minutes of every day of writing is like, having, I don't know, it's just a bad feeling, and most sane people would run from that bad feeling, which is a way of not getting anything done. And you get to a point where you realize that as bad as it's going to be to start writing, the energy that you're expending, reading yet another book about the Hittites, is you just get fed up with it, and you start to also feel, and I think you have to be careful about this, that if you read too much, you get buried under the research and your imagination, because what is historical? Why do we do fiction based on history? It's not just another fancy way of writing history. It's to do things that historians really mustn't do, which is to imagine what's lost. It's a consolation. It's what art is for. It's like you partially get Eurydice out of hell, and then she's going to go back. She's not going to come all the way back and be alive again, because nobody can do that. You can't really bring the dead back. The reason we make art is to sort of partially, as much as we possibly can, it's the closest we can come to resurrection in the world, at any rate. And his history is a record of what can be recuperated from loss. You can put together an incredible amount of stuff, and suddenly there's the Lincoln administration in a really great history book. But the really good historians are going to say, and yet we have no idea. There's a famous moment of a blind memo where Lincoln, before he'll tell his cabinet about the Emancipation Proclamation, he makes them sign this thing without telling them what it is, and then it turns out to be a memo. I think the point of it is that, I can't even remember what it's for, but it's this weird thing, and there is no historical explanation for it. Nobody knows why he made, what he was trying to do. It's some weird thing, parlor trick that he was pulling with the cabinet. It didn't work. They were confused by it. Gideon Wells writes about it in his journal and says, I don't know what he was doing. We'll never know. It's gone. It's a small thing. There are some bigger things that are just lost, and that loss is an occasion for grief, as all loss is. So we make historical fiction to go into those places. And you have to, if it's not based in history, then it's fiction. It's not historical fiction. But if you're going to have some faculty to go into those places, you have to make sure that you're not so, worried about which of the 97 accounts of any given moment is the right one, that you just aren't using your empathy, your empathic imagination to try and invent it. So I think that's good luck. I mean, it's
And good luck is a good place to stop. So thanks to Tony, the Strand,
Yeah, thanks so
and
much,
Ms. Strand. Thank you.